Well, step off the bike. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just looked at him calm, steady, like she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. Officer, she said quietly, may I ask what I did wrong? He didn't answer. That silence would cost him everything. If this kind of story hits close to home, drop the name of your city in the comments right now. Let's see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will change how you see everything. Afternoon sun over the stretch of highway outside Phoenix, Arizona, was the kind of heat that didn't ask permission. It pressed down on everything: the asphalt, the guardrails, of passing cars, with the full weight of a desert summer that had decided it wasn't finished yet. It itself seemed to shimmer, bending the distant road into something liquid and uncertain. Emily Carter didn't notice the heat. She never did when she was riding. When you spend enough years behind the handlebars of a machine you built with your own hands, it stops being just a road. It becomes something else, entirely something closer to a conversation. The of the engine wasn't noise to Emily. It was a language she had learned to speak long before she ever learned how to properly explain herself to strangers. She was 26 years old, and she had been working on motorcycles since she was 11. Tinkering, not playing, working. Her father had put a wrench in her hand when most fathers were putting dolls in their daughters' rooms, and she had never put it down. By the time she was 16, she could disassemble and reassemble a carburetor faster than most adult mechanics at shops 3 times the size of her father's garage. By 18, she had rebuilt her first engine from the ground up, a busted old Triumph Bonneville that everyone else had written off as scrap. By 22, she had opened her own shop. The Ducati Panigale V4 she was riding today was not purchased. It was created. 3 years of sourcing parts, rebuilding components, replacing everything that didn't meet her standard, and testing every single system until she was satisfied. The bike was red because she chose red. It was fast because she built it to be fast. It was hers in a way that went far beyond what any title document could prove it was hers, in the way that things you make with your own hands belong to you in a place no court can touch. Her helmet on, her license in her pocket, her registration in the small document holder mounted to the frame, and her insurance card right beside it. Everything was in order. Everything was exactly right. That would not matter to Officer Daniel Brooks. He was 34 years old and had been with the department for 6 years. Not a bad man. That is important to understand, because what happened that afternoon was not the story of a villain, more complicated and, in many ways, the story of a man who had built a picture of the world in his mind and had stopped checking whether the picture was accurate. He was riding patrol with his partner, Officer Marcus Reed, who was 15 years his senior and who had spent those 15 years watching younger officers make every mistake in the book and a few that weren't written down anywhere yet. When Brooks spotted the red Ducati, something in him shifted before he could even explain why. Later, if you asked him to put words to it, he might have said it was instinct. He might have said something felt off. He might have said that in his experience, combinations of things added up to something worth checking. A performance motorcycle worth tens of thousands of dollars. Highway outside Phoenix. A rider moving a little too comfortably for someone who might be nervous about something. He wouldn't say what he was really thinking because what he was really thinking was not something he was fully aware of. It lived in a layer of his mind just below the surface of his conscious reasoning, where assumptions don't show their faces but still do their work. That plate, he said. Reed glanced over. What are we looking for? Just run it. Reed ran it. Plate came back clean. Clean plate, Reed said. His tone flat, already beginning to suspect where this was heading. Come over anyway, Brooks said. Reed was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he activated the lights. Emily saw the lights in her mirror before she heard the siren. Her first reaction, and this says everything about who she was not fear. It was confusion. She ran through her speed in her head. It had been speeding. She thought about lane position. Fine. She thought about her signals. She had used them about her lights, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. All fine. Everything was fine. She pulled over anyway. That is what you do. And she put both feet on the ground and waited. Officer Brooks climbed out of the patrol car and walked toward her with the particular kind of stride that some officers develop over years, not aggressive, exactly, but deliberate, measured. The walk of someone who has decided something before they have confirmed it. License and registration, he said. Emily didn't rush. She moved carefully, announcing each action the way her father had taught her to years ago when she was barely a teenager. And he first started teaching her about what it meant to be a young woman on the road. "I'm to reach into my jacket pocket for my license," she said. "Okay?" Brooks nodded. She produced her license. Then she reached toward the document holder on the frame, slowly, deliberately, and produced her registration and insurance card. He looked at them for a long time. Emily asked. "Just give me a minute," he said. Back to the patrol car. Reed was already looking at his partner with an expression that had seen this before and didn't love what it recognized. "Everything checks out," Reed said, looking at his screen. "Registration is valid. Insurance is active. License is clean, no priors. Violations, nothing. She's completely clear." Brooks didn't respond. "Daniel," Reed said, using his first name the way partners do when they are trying to say something without saying it out loud. "She's completely clear. I just want to ask her a few questions," Brooks said. Reed leaned back. "About what?" "About the bike." When Brooks returned to where Emily was waiting, she had not moved. She was standing exactly where he had left her, patient in a way that went beyond politeness. She was patient the way someone is patient when they know they are right and have decided not to let anyone else's confusion become their chaos. "Can I ask you a few questions about this motorcycle?" "Of course," she said. "A Panigale V4. "Yes." "These retail for," he paused, as if checking a number in his head, "somewhere around $40,000. "Depending on the build." "Yes," Emily said again. "Depending on the build. So this is your motorcycle?" "Yes." "You purchased it?" There was a pause, not a nervous pause, not the pause of someone caught in something. The pause of someone deciding how honest to be and deciding to be completely honest. "I built it," she said. I looked at her. "I'm a motorcycle mechanic," she said. "In a repair and custom shop. I sourced the parts over about 3 years and built the bike myself. It is in my name. The registration you have in your hand is current. The insurance is active. Is there something specific you're looking for?" He looked at the bike. Her looked at her. "You built this yourself," he repeated. "A Panigale V4. "Yes, from parts." "From parts," she confirmed. Her voice was so steady, so completely without apology, that it should have been the end of the conversation. It was not. "How long have you been riding?" "About 15 years. "You started at 11, she said. "They taught me." Brooks wrote something in his notebook. Emily watched him write it without expression. "And what's the name of your shop?" "Carter Customs and Performance," she said. "On West Camelback Road. You can look it up." He wrote that down too. "Is there something wrong with my documentation?" Emily asked. "No," he said. "Is there a reason for the stop?" He paused. "But we observed." "What did you observe?" she asked. Combative, genuinely asking. He didn't finish the sentence. That was the first moment Emily knew exactly what was happening. On the patrol car, Marcus Reed had stopped looking at his screen. Mercy. He was watching his partner stand on the side of that highway, trying to build a case out of air, and he felt something he recognized from 15 years of this job, the low, specific discomfort of watching someone do something that cannot be undone once it goes far enough. Well, he had seen it before. Not always dramatic, not always loud. Sometimes it looked exactly like this, a routine, stop that wasn't routine, questions that had no legal purpose, a delay that grew longer while the justification for it grew smaller. About saying something. He didn't. Not yet. Himself, he was still watching, still assessing, still giving his partner the benefit of the doubt he had always believed every person deserved. Doubt was already there, and it was growing. "Peak, do I have any affiliation with motorcycle clubs or organizations?" Brooks asked. Emily looked at him steadily. Why do you ask? He gestured toward the bike, toward a small decal mounted near the tail. It was modest in size, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking. Hells Angels community insignia, not a gang patch, a formal member identifier. A community decal, the kind that shows connection to a local charitable chapter, sold at events and fundraisers and used by riders who want to show solidarity with a community rather than declare criminal allegiance. Emily had grown up around that insignia. Her father had one on his jacket. Well, that decal represents a community I grew up around, Emily said carefully. It doesn't represent any criminal activity. It's not a gang affiliation marker, a community symbol. Your father is a member? She looked at him for a long moment. There is a respected member of his local chapter. Yes. And you're familiar with the chapter, officer, she said. And for the first time, there was something in her voice, not anger, not yet, but something firmer, something that had decided it had answered enough questions without receiving answers in return. I have provided you with valid documentation. My license is clean. My registration is current. My insurance is active. Your cycle is legally mine. I've been standing here, for she glanced at the time. 22 minutes. Can you tell me what violation you stopped me for? He did not answer. Because if there isn't one, she continued, I'd like to know if I'm free to go. The word no did not come out of his mouth. There did yes. He stood there, caught between the answer he needed to have and the answer he didn't have. I just have a few more questions, he said. That was the moment Emily Carter made a decision. She had been calm. She had been cooperative. She had answered every question, including the ones she wasn't required to answer. She had provided everything that was asked of her, and she had done it without attitude, without aggression, without giving anyone anything to use against her. 22 minutes had become 30, and 30 was becoming something she recognized as a problem that was going to keep growing unless something changed. She reached slowly into her jacket, announced it as she did, and produced her phone. "I record this interaction," she said. "Is that okay?" "You don't need to do that," Brooks said. "I don't need to," she replied. "I'm informing you that I'm going to." The phone went up. The red dot appeared, and Officer Brooks looked at the lens of that camera the way people look at something that has just changed the rules of the situation they thought they were controlling. Marcus Reed, watching from the patrol car, exhaled slowly. Here we go, he thought. The recording began at the 31-minute mark of a stop that had no legal foundation. Kept her voice neutral. She kept the camera steady. Her composure in that specific practiced way that people keep composure when they are afraid, but have decided that fear does not get to make the decisions. Because here is what nobody standing on that highway knew except Emily herself. Afraid, not of Officer Brooks, not of the situation escalating. She had enough experience and enough legal knowledge to understand where the lines were. She was afraid because she had been in enough conversations with enough people riders, friends, people she grew up around, to know that most people in her position did not know what she knew. Most people did not know they could record. Most people did not know they could ask why they were stopped. Most people did not know that clean documentation had to be respected. That a valid license and registration and insurance meant something. The absence of a violation meant the absence of a right to continue the stop. Most people got scared, and when they got scared, they consented to things they never had to consent to. They answered questions they never had to answer. They waited twice as long as anyone had the right to make them wait. About all of those people as she held up that phone. She was recording for herself, yes, but she was also recording for all of them. "Officer," she said to the camera in a voice that was clear and precise, "can you state the reason for this traffic stop?" Silence. "Officer Brooks," she said, reading his badge, "can you tell me what traffic violation prompted this stop?" He shifted his weight. "We observed." "What did you observe?" she asked. There's silence. "I'd like to know what you observed," she said, perfectly. "Because my documentation is valid, my license is clean. I've been standing here for 32 minutes. He looked at the camera. He looked at her. He looked back at the car, where Marcus Reed was now leaning against the door, Arms crossed, watching. I observed the motorcycle moving at a speed that I believed warranted a stop. Emily waited. What speed was that? I'll need to check my notes. You don't have it written down already? The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone. 3 miles back down the highway, there's 3 motorcycles turned onto the ramp. The lead rider moved with the particular ease of someone who has spent decades in the saddle, not fast, aggressive, not demonstrating anything, just present, forceful. The kind of rider who doesn't need to prove anything about how well he can handle a machine because the way he handles a machine makes the point without trying. Was 54 years old. He had worked in the trades for 30 years. He had raised his daughter alone from the time she was 8, a wrench in her hand and a book in her lap, and told her that every single day of her growing up the same thing, well, your knowledge is yours. Nobody can pull you over for knowing too much. He had received her call 20 minutes ago. He had not panicked. He had not sped. He had gathered 2 trusted friends from his chapter and ridden at a steady pace toward the highway where his daughter was standing on the side of the road with her phone in the air. He was not coming to rescue her. He understood, better than almost anyone, that she did not need rescuing. He was coming because a father, when his child calls from the side of a road, comes. That is the only reason. Officer Brooks heard the motorcycles before he saw them. The sound of 3 bikes on the highway at legal speed is not remarkable. Almost all day on a road like that. But something in the rhythm of it, something in the way they slowed, the way they moved toward the shoulder, the way they stopped just behind the patrol car with the kind of precision that comes from discipline, made the hair on the back of his neck move. 3 riders, 3 bikes, helmets coming off in the heat. In front was not young. His face carried the kind of lines that come from decades of weather and work. In his eyes, when he looked at Emily and found her standing steady with her phone in the air, carried the kind of relief that is really love wearing a practical face. "Hey kid," Raymond Carter said. "Hey dad," Emily replied. She had not dropped the camera. Brooks looked at the 3 riders. Eyes moved to the patches, the insignia, the markers of identity that his mind immediately began assembling into something it already thought it recognized. Marcus Reed had stepped out of the patrol car. He was watching Raymond Carter walk toward his daughter, and he was watching the way she met him, not running, not crying, not performing distress for the camera, just standing there with the particular calm of someone who has been handling things herself for a long time and knows how to let someone else stand beside her without handing the situation over. "Are you okay?" Raymond asked. "I'm okay," she said. For 37 minutes with no stated violation. It all on video. Raymond turned slowly toward Officer Brooks. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't perform. Gesture. He just looked at the man standing between him and the highway and asked that every minute of those 37 minutes had been building toward. What did she do? Silence on the highway. A semi-truck moved past at 65 miles an hour, and the wind from it washed over all of them and then was gone. Their evidence, Raymond said, they're quiet, they're calm. That absolute stillness that is more powerful than any raised voice. "Did you have to stop my daughter?" Brooks opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "Her plate is clean," Raymond said. "I know because she called me, and I looked it up before I got in the saddle. Her registration is current. Her insurance is active. License is clean. She's never had so much as a warning in 15 years of riding. Bike is legally hers. She built it herself. I watched her build it." He took a step closer. Aggressive, not threatening, just present. "What?" he said, for the 3rd time, and each repetition landed heavier than the one before. "Did she do?" Officer Marcus Reed, 15 years of experience standing behind his eyes, watched his partner try to find an answer to a question that had no answer. He made a decision. He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch," he said. "There's Reed, Unit 14. I need a supervisor at my location. Way 17-mile marker 41. Copy?" Brooks turned toward him sharply. "Copy? Unit 14. Dispatch replied. "Supervisor en route." Emily Carter lowered her phone just slightly not to stop recording. To look at the older officer. Something had shifted. On the side of that highway, in the last dry heat of a Phoenix afternoon, their father standing beside her and two strangers who had ridden miles out of their day, standing a few feet back, her felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, sought, not vindication. Something quieter and more difficult, the specific weight of being right about something that should never have had to happen in the first place, and knowing that being right about it didn't make it okay, knowing that it had probably already happened to someone else who didn't know what she knew. She raised the camera again. She kept recording because that was the point. Always been the point. Sergeant Olivia Bennett arrived in 11 minutes of her vehicle and took in the scene with the quick of someone who had handled too many situations exactly like this one. The two officers, the camera, the other motorcycles parked behind the patrol car, 39 minutes of stop with no stated cause. She looked at the recording timestamp. She looked at the documentation Emily handed her, at the notes in Brooks's notebook. Then she looked at Brooks. Officer Brooks, she said, can you walk me through the basis for this stop? He gave her the same answer he had given Emily. She let the silence after that answer sit for exactly as long as it needed to sit. She turned to Emily. Miss Carter, she said, your documents are in order. Has no documented legal basis. You're free to go. The right to file a formal complaint, and I can provide you with the information to do that. Emily looked at her steadily. Like that information, she said. Of course, said Sergeant Bennett. Emily said the thing that nobody on that highway expected. First, she said, I want to ask you something. Bennett waited. Many times, Emily said, has this happened to someone else on this road who didn't have their documents ready? Arranges. Who didn't know they could record? Who didn't have someone they could call? The sergeant didn't answer immediately. I don't think I'm the first, Emily said. I don't want to be the last one who had to stand on this highway wondering if facts were going to matter or not. The highway stretched out behind her long, fat, unforgiving in the heat. The red Ducati caught the last of the afternoon light. And Emily Carter, 26 years old, mechanic, builder, her daughter stood with her phone in her hand and her documentation in her pocket and her father beside her, and she didn't look like someone who had been wronged. She looked like someone who had just figured out exactly what she was going to do about it. Sergeant Olivia Bennett had been with the department for 19 years. She had seen traffic stops go wrong in every direction imaginable, wrong for the officer, wrong for the driver, wrong for everyone standing on the side of the road, trying to figure out which version of the truth was going to win the afternoon. She had cleaned up messes that took months to untangle, reports that filled entire filing cabinets across from people in internal review meetings where nobody in the room wanted to be there. She had seen everything. She had not seen this. Exactly this. She stood in front of Emily Carter with a clipboard she hadn't opened yet and a recording she hadn't finished watching. And she felt the specific weight of a situation that was still moving, still unfolding, still deciding what it was going to become, and she understood the way that 19 years teaches you to understand things before they fully arrive. What happened on this highway was not finished. Not by a long way. Miss Carter, she said, before you go, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. Emily held the phone steady. The thing was still running. I'm asking whether I'm the first person this has happened to. I can't speak to other stops, Bennett said carefully. Asking you to confirm anything right now, Emily said. I'm asking whether the question is worth someone looking into. Bennett looked at her, really looked at her, not the way Brooks had looked at her through a filter, through an assumption, through a picture assembled before the facts arrived. She looked at her the way you look at someone when you are trying to understand exactly who you are dealing with and what they are capable of. What she saw surprised her, not because Emily was angry, not because she was performing, not because she was doing any of the things people do when they feel wronged and want the world to know it. In the way that people are calm when they have already decided what they are going to do and are no longer spending energy on being upset about what brought them to that decision. Calm was rare. Bennett had learned to pay attention to it. Note your question in my report, Bennett said. I'd appreciate that, Emily replied. Raymond Carter had not moved from beside his daughter during this exchange. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, and his expression unreadable in the specific way of a man who has spent a lifetime knowing when to speak and when to let someone else's words do the work. He had raised this girl. He knew her moves before she made them. He watched her talk to the sergeant with something in his chest that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief. It was something older and harder to name. There's something that felt like watching a seed become a tree and realizing you'd forgotten how tall it was going to grow. Marcus Reed's eye across the hood of the patrol car. Reed looked away first. That said, more than either of them would have put into words. Officer Brooks had not spoken since the sergeant arrived. He was standing slightly behind and to the left of his position when Bennett pulled up, which is this particular way people stand when they are trying to be present without drawing attention to how present they are. He had his notebook in his hand. He had written nothing new in it for the last 12 minutes. It was open to the same half-finished notes that had been there since before Emily pulled out her phone. And the words on it, whatever they said, were not going to be enough. He knew that now. He just didn't know yet what it was going to mean. Turned back to her vehicle, then stopped. She turned back toward Emily. The formal complaint process. Do you want me to walk you through it now? Or would you prefer to receive information in writing? In writing is fine, Emily said. I'll need the supervisor's name, badge number, and incident report number. Bennett gave her all three without hesitation. Emily typed them into her phone. She was still recording. She was always still recording. Brooks watched her type. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically. The way things shift in movies, where a character has a sudden visible revelation and the music changes. Tighter than that, it was the slow, uncomfortable movement of a person who has spent an afternoon being certain about something and is beginning to understand, in a way they cannot yet fully admit, that certainty was the problem. About what he had said to Reed in the patrol car. Come over anyway. 3 words. 3 quiet words, and he had said them without hesitation, without explanation, with the ease of someone who thought they were following instinct. Having to understand that instinct had a name he wasn't comfortable saying out loud. Yet, maybe not ever, but it was there. And standing on the side of that highway, a 26-year-old woman calmly recorded the badge number of his supervising officer. After 41 minutes of a stop with no legal foundation, the way you feel something you have been avoiding, like stepping on a nail in the dark and realizing it was always there. You had just never walked that particular path in bare feet before. Reed came around the back of the patrol car and stopped beside him. You doing okay? He asked. Brooks looked at him. What do you mean? I mean what I said, Reed replied. Okay? I'm fine, Brooks said. Reed let a beat pass. Then he said quietly, let her corner so none of the others could hear. Daniel, what were you looking for? Brooks didn't answer. When you said pull them over, Reed continued, what were you actually looking for? Because it wasn't a traffic violation. I was watching your eyes when you saw that bike. And I know what I saw, and I think you do too. And I think this is the moment where you decide whether you're going to be honest about it. The silence between them stretched longer than the conversation. No, Brooks finally said. And that was the first true thing he had said since the stop began. Their exhaled. Yeah, he said. That's what I thought. He walked back toward the patrol car, leaving Brooks standing alone with a notebook full of insufficient notes and a question he had answered honestly for the first time and didn't like the sound of. Carter secured her documentation, put her phone in her pocket. She had saved the recording 3 times in 3 different locations before she put it away and pulled on her helmet. She looked at her father. Raymond pulled her into a brief embrace the kind fathers give when they are proud and scared and relieved all at once and don't have the words to separate those things into individual sentences. He asked. I'm good, she said. You sure? She stepped back and looked at him. Lord, I had everything I needed. He almost smiled. Almost. I know you did. I came anyway. I know you did, she said. I called. She swung onto the Ducati. The engine came to life under her, not a roar, not a growl. Just the smooth, even, well-tuned sound of a machine that had been built to work perfectly by someone who knew exactly what perfect sounded like. Onto the highway. Raymond watched her go until she was too far to see clearly, which was longer than most people would have waited, because he was a father, and that is what fathers do. Then he turned and looked at Officer Brooks one more time. But he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He put on his helmet, and he and the two men who had ridden out with him returned to their bikes, and they were gone in less than 40 seconds clean, quiet, leaving nothing behind except the fact of what had happened. Brooks was still standing there. He stood there long after everyone else was gone. Highway moved around him the way highways do. He was unconcerned and constant, carrying everyone else's ordinary afternoons in both directions at 65 miles an hour. There, and he thought about the question Reed had asked him. What were you actually looking for? He didn't have an answer that he was proud of. That was going to matter more than he understood yet. As Emily Carter was not done, she had barely started. A formal complaint was filed 48 hours later. It was 8 pages long, not because Emily had padded it, because she was trying to make the story bigger than it was. It was 8 pages long because she had documented everything, the exact time of the stop, questions asked, the answers given. The moment she was told she could not ask the reason for the stop, documentation check and its results, the arrival of the additional officers, arrival of the supervisor, and the specific moment when a supervisor had confirmed in her own words that the stop had no documented legal basis. Of the video, she had the timestamps. She had the badge numbers. She had the incident report number Bennett had given her. Also had something else. She had 15 years of watching people get pulled over for nothing. And she had the specific, focused fury of someone who had finally been the one standing on the side of the road instead of hearing the story afterward. The man she brought the complaint to was named David Parker. He was 51 years old and had been practicing civil rights law for 23 years. First, he had an office in Phoenix with a waiting room that was usually full and a reputation that was longer than his case list, which was saying something. He did not take every case that came through his door. The ones where the facts were clear, the documentation was solid, and the person sitting across from him understood what they were asking for and why. Emily Carter sat across from him on a Tuesday morning and put a flash drive on his desk. "Well, recording is on there," she said. 41 minutes, uncut. "I have 3 copies. He picked up the flash drive and looked at it. "What do you want?" he asked. Not unkindly, just directly. Sure. In his experience, that was always the right first question. "I don't know how many times this has already happened," Emily said. "Looked up. Because I don't think this was a mistake," she continued. "Well, I think this was a pattern. And I think the only reason nobody has done anything about it is because most people didn't have 41 minutes of video and a supervisor's verbal confirmation on record." Parker set the flash drive down carefully. That's a significant claim. "I know," she said. "I'm here." He leaned back in his chair. "If what you're describing is accurate and based on what you've told me, believe it is then. The complaint against the officer is relatively straightforward. Clean documentation, no stated violation. Extended stop, supervisor confirmation of no legal basis. That's a strong record." "I know," Emily said again. "If you want to go beyond your individual case," he said, "that's a different conversation. That means records requests. On analysis, that means I know what it means," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about it since I got back on the bike." He studied her. "Most people who come into my office want justice for themselves. That's completely legitimate. That's what I'm here for. I want that too," she said. "I want the record to show what happened. I want the stop documented as unlawful. Not in writing. But if there's a pattern," she said, "I believe there is, then stopping at my case means the next person still gets pulled over without knowing why." Parker was quiet for a moment. 33 years, he had heard a lot of reasons why people wanted to fight. But he had heard anger and grief and exhaustion and the particular bright heat of someone who had just been through something and was still running on adrenaline. He had heard all of it, and he had learned to tell the difference between what burned hot and went cold and what burns at a temperature that could last through a very long fight. Her part burned steady. He could tell that from 5 minutes across the desk from her. Right, he said. Let's start with the records. The records request went in that same week. Under Arizona public records law, the department was required to provide documented information on traffic stops, including outcomes, duration, documentation checks, and whether violations were cited within a reasonable window. Parker had made enough of these requests to know how to read the data when it came back. Emily had made enough of these requests through her own research, what she was looking for, they were both looking for, right about what they suspected, and neither of them felt good about being right. The data came back 23 days later. Parker called her the afternoon it arrived. How many? She asked. Before he could begin his summary, he paused. In the last 18 months, as we requested, there are 67 documented stops involving motorcycle riders where the stop resulted in no citation, warning, no arrest, and no documented stated cause. Silence on the line. There were, Emily repeated. 67, he confirmed. And that's only the stops where the paperwork was complete enough to analyze. There are an additional 22 stops with incomplete or missing documentation. Emily sat down. She didn't remember deciding to sit her legs, just found the chair without asking the rest of her. Stop, she said slowly. In 18 months. No citations, no cause. That we know of, Parker said. The records we requested cover specific corridors. There may be more. She was quiet for a long time. Enough that Parker said, Emily, I'm here, she said. First. She stopped. I wasn't wrong. No, Parker said. Well, I weren't. I didn't want to be right, she said. And that was the truest thing she had said out loud since the day she filed the complaint. It was the thing she hadn't told anyone yet, not her father, her friends, not the riders she had started talking to in the days after the stop. She had walked around for 3 weeks with the quiet, sick certainty that the data was going to confirm exactly what she suspected. And she had not wanted to feel that certainty confirmed, because confirmation meant the problem was bigger than one bad afternoon on a highway outside Phoenix. Information meant it was a pattern. And patterns do not fix themselves. What do we do with this? She asked. We document it, Parker said. We present it formally. And then you decide how far you want to take it. She thought about the highway, about the way the afternoon sun had pressed down on her while she stood on the shoulder, waiting for facts to matter. About 67 other people on other shoulders, on other afternoons, about how many of them had had the documentation she had, and how many had not, and what had happened to the ones who had not. Take it as far as it goes, she said. Parker said, no, I'm not doing it for the money, she said. I want that in the record too. It will be, he said. Hung up the phone and sat alone in her shop, surrounded by motorcycles in various states of assembly, surrounded by the tools and parts and knowledge she had built her life around. And she thought about 67 strangers who had stood on the side of a road and not known what she knew. And she started making calls. The first call was to a woman named Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell was 44 years old and had been teaching motorcycle safety for 16 years. She ran a certified training program out of a facility on the eastern edge of the city, and she had a student roster that was 200 names long on any given month, which meant she had access to the exact community Emily needed to reach. About your stop, Sarah said, before Emily had finished introducing herself. Most people have, Emily said. Word travels fast in this community, Sarah said. Always does. You're not the first person I've heard about something like this happening to. I know, Emily said. I'm calling. She laid out what she had, the data, complaint, the attorney, the recordings. She laid it out the way she laid out a parts list for a rebuild, completely, in order, without padding it, and without leaving anything out. Sarah listened without interrupting, which was the sign of someone who understood that the information mattered more than their reaction to it. Finally finished, he Sarah was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. And then she said, "What do you need from me?" Emily had been ready for a dozen different responses. Irritation, concern about the politics of it, questions about how it might affect the training program, the normal friction that comes when someone is being asked to do something that goes beyond what they plan to do that week. "I need from you," she repeated. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "What do you need?" And Emily felt something unlock in her chest, some knot of tension she had been carrying since the moment the patrol car lights went on in her mirror. A little breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and she felt it release, all at once, but enough. "I need a place to hold a meeting," she said, "and I need people who can talk about their rights without being afraid." "I have both," Sarah said. "There. As soon as you can manage it." "Next Thursday," Sarah said. "I'll make calls tonight." That was how it started. Their Thursday meeting was supposed to be small. 30 people, maybe 40. A classroom at Sarah's facility with folding chairs and a whiteboard and a legal handout that Parker had helped Emily draft clean, written in language that a writer with no legal background could understand and use on the side of a road in 45 seconds. 63 people showed up. They came on bikes and in cars. They came in their riding gear and in their work clothes. And old, experienced and brand new, some with stories, and some who had just heard about the meeting and wanted to understand what was happening. Sarah stood at the front of that room, and she was not a public speaker. She had never wanted to be a public speaker. She was a mechanic. She understood machines, and she understood the logic of how things fit together. And she understood how to rebuild something broken into something functional. But she had never stood in front of 63 people and asked them to listen to her. Well, she did it anyway. She started with her own story, not because it was the most dramatic in the room, because it was hers, and she could tell it without getting lost in it, because it was documented, every minute of it, or in a way that was harder to dismiss than a story told from memory. She told them about the documentation check that came back clean, told them about the questions that had no legal basis, told them about the 41 minutes. She told them about the 67 stops. And then she said the thing she had been building towards since she picked up the phone to call her father from the side of that highway. "Most of you," she said, "have probably had a moment on the road where something happened and you weren't sure if you were handling it right. Where you answered questions you maybe didn't have to answer. Where you waited longer than you had to wait. Where you consented to something because you didn't know you could say no." The room was quiet. "I'm not here to tell you that every officer is wrong," she said. "I'm not here to make this us versus them, because that's not what this is. This is a gap. A gap between what riders know about their rights and what actually happens on the side of a road." She held up the handout Parker had helped her write. "I want every single person in this room to have memorized before they ride next week," she said. "Not because you're going to need it, but because the day you do need it, you're not going to have time to look it up." The room erupted. In applause, though, that came too, in conversation. Recognition. In the specific, charged energy of a group of people who have all had the same experience in isolation and are discovering, in real time, that isolation was part of the problem. Story after story came out of that room. A man who had been stopped 3 times in a single summer on the same road, cited, never given a reason. A woman who had consented to a search because she didn't know she could decline. A matter who had been held for an hour while his documentation was repeatedly checked despite coming back clean every single time. 62 years old who had been riding for 40 years and had never once filed a complaint because he didn't know there was a process and nobody had ever told him. And he had just accepted each stop as the cost of being who he was on the road. Emily listened to every single one of them. She didn't interrupt. She didn't redirect. She let them talk. Because talking was the first step. Every story that came out of someone's mouth in that room was a story that had been sitting in their chest collecting weight. The weight needed somewhere to go. After 2 hours, when the room finally started to breathe at a lower frequency, Mitchell stood beside Emily and looked at the 63 people in those folding chairs and said, quietly to Emily only. This is going to be bigger than one meeting. Emily nodded slowly. Oh, she said. Are you ready for that? Sarah asked. Emily looked around the room at the old man who had never filed a complaint, who hadn't known she could say no, at the young riders who hadn't been riding long enough to know what normal was supposed to look like, all the faces that had come through that door carrying something they had been carrying alone. I don't think ready is the right word, she said honestly. I'm doing it anyway. That was the answer Sarah Mitchell needed. Nodded once, and she pulled out her phone and she started making the second round of calls. 3 days after the meeting, something happened that Emily had not anticipated. Marcus Reed called David Parker's office and left a message. A complaint, not a challenge, a request. He wanted to make a voluntary statement on the record, documented about what he had witnessed during the traffic stop on Highway 17. Parker called Emily immediately. The officer who was in the patrol car, he said, "Partner, he wants to give a statement." Emily sat down. "What kind of statement?" "He says, and I'm reading from the message, he says, he wants to describe what he observed during the stop and what he believes the training gaps are that led to it." She was quiet for a long moment. "In trouble?" "Not from this," Parker said. He didn't initiate the stop. The documentation shows his actions were by the book from the point where he called for a supervisor. "This appears to be voluntary." "Why would he do that?" Emily asked. Parker considered the question. "In my experience," he said slowly, "sometimes people who witness something wrong and don't stop it early enough decide afterward that the least they can do is tell the truth about what they saw." Emily thought about the man she had seen, leaning against the patrol car, arms crossed, watching the situation unfold. She thought about the 3 seconds of silence when Brooks had said, "Pull them over anyway." About the way Reed had called for a supervisor without being asked to. "He knew," she said quietly. "He knew something was wrong from the beginning." "It sounds like it," Parker agreed. "Why didn't he say something sooner?" she asked. And there was something in her voice that wasn't quite anger. It was the more complicated thing, the harder thing, the thing that lives in the space between understanding why someone didn't act and wishing they had. Or let her question sit without trying to answer it. Because some questions aren't requests for information. "What do we do with his statement?" she asked. "That's your call," he said. His testimony could significantly strengthen the pattern argument. An enforcement officer confirming from the inside that the stop had no valid basis and that there are training gaps that carries weight, that external documentation alone doesn't always carry. She thought about it for longer than she usually took to make decisions. She said, "Set up the meeting, but I want to be there." Parker said, "I'll arrange it." She hung up and sat alone in her shop again. About Marcus Reed leaning against that patrol car, almost watching his partner stand on the side of the road without a legal reason for being there. About what it had cost him to call. She wasn't sure yet whether she respected it or resented it. Maybe, she thought, it was possible to feel both at the same time. Maybe that was the honest thing. She picked up a torque wrench and went back to the engine she had been rebuilding before the phone rang, and she worked in silence until the light changed. About 67 stops, and one man who had watched something go wrong and hadn't stopped it soon enough, another man who still hadn't admitted what he had actually been looking for when he said pull them over anyway. About the old man in the folding chair who had ridden for 40 years and never filed a complaint. About the woman who hadn't known she could say no. About all of it. And she kept working. Because that was how she had always handled the things that were too large to think about all at once. You work. You keep your hands busy. You figure out what's broken. And then you fix it. Marcus Reed walked into David Parker's office on a Wednesday morning and sat down like a man who had not slept well in several weeks. He looked disheveled, he didn't. His uniform was pressed. Posture was correct. His hands were steady on the table. There was something behind his eyes that had the particular quality of a person who has been having a long conversation with himself and has finally reached a conclusion he doesn't love but can no longer avoid. Emily was already seated when he arrived. She had gotten there 15 minutes early because she needed the time to settle into the room before he walked through the door and get comfortable enough with the space that his arrival wouldn't throw her off balance. Sarah sat at the head of the table. A recorder was on between them. Reed had consented to it in writing before he came in. And at Emily when he sat down. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Reed said, "I owe you an apology." Emily said nothing. "Not for my partner's actions," he continued. "I apologize for another person, but I can apologize for the 3 seconds between when he said pull them over and when I activated the lights. Because in those 3 seconds, I knew we didn't have a basis, and I activated the lights anyway." Parker said quietly, "The record, Officer Reed. Can you state what your basis for that assessment was? Did you observe that told you there was no valid reason for the stop?" Reed looked at the recorder. "It came back clean before we initiated the stop. There was no traffic violation observed. There was no erratic behavior, no speed issue, no lane issue. The stop was," he paused, "cost him something. You could see it cost him something. It was based on how the rider looked, on assumptions. Specifically," Parker pressed. "Specifically," Reed said, "a young woman on an expensive motorcycle. The combination didn't fit a picture my partner had in his mind. Instead of questioning the picture, he questioned the rider." Emily had been listening with her hands flat on the table and her face completely still. She had decided before she walked in that she was going to listen to everything he said before she responded to any of it, because she had learned that her first reaction to difficult things was rarely her most useful one. This was harder than she had prepared for. Not because Reed was lying, because he wasn't. He was sitting across from her, being completely honest and honesty about something that had already happened and could not be undone, had a specific quality of pain to it that anger didn't touch. Anger was easier. Anger had an outlet. This was just the truth. Barber sitting in the room with them, too late to have prevented anything. "Why didn't you say something at the start?" she asked. Voice was level. She had worked for that. Reed didn't look away. I told myself I was giving him the benefit of the doubt. I told myself maybe he had seen something I hadn't. Myself that 15 years of this job means you sometimes trust your partner's instinct even when you can't see the reasoning yet. And when the database came back clean, then I told myself I'd give it another few minutes, he said. And then another few. Then you had been standing there for 22 minutes and I still hadn't said anything because I had been giving him so many benefits of so many doubts that I had talked myself out of doing the right thing while you stood on the side of a highway doing nothing wrong. The room was very quiet. "Officer Reed," Parker said carefully, "in your 15 years with this department, have you seen situations similar to this one? Stops initiated without clear legal basis." Reed's jaw tightened. "Sir, on how many occasions, approximately?" He was quiet for 5 full seconds. "More than I'm comfortable saying." "Can you give me a number?" "Enough," he said. "Enough that this wasn't a surprise." That's the honest answer. "Enough that when he said pull them over, my instinct wasn't what violation did he see. It was what assumption is he working with. And that instinct came from experience, which means I had seen this before, which means I knew what it looked like. And I called in a supervisor at the 41-minute mark instead of at the 30-second mark. And that is on me." Emily looked at him. "What stopped you?" Earlier, he met her eyes. "Loyalty," he said. "Unkind. The kind that calls itself loyalty, but is really just not wanting to be the person who goes against their partner. Wanting to be that officer. Because in this job, hard thing to be. Harder than watching someone stand on the side of the road for 41 minutes with no reason." He held her gaze. "Oh," he said quietly. "Not harder than that. I just didn't understand that clearly enough until I was watching it happen." Parker set down his pen. "Officer Reed, what would you say the primary training gap was? Based on what you observed?" Reed thought about it. The surface answer, you could see him going past the surface answer, going to the one that was further down and harder to say. "Some up isn't in policy," he said finally. "The policy is clear. Up someone, you have a reason, you document it. Up is in recognition. in knowing when what you're feeling is instinct versus assumption. Or cause, in knowing the difference between something that actually looks wrong and something that just looks different from what you expected. He leaned forward slightly. In the moment, those two things can feel identical. And if nobody ever taught you to question the feeling, to ask yourself, wait, is this actual evidence or is this a picture in my head? Then you can go 6 years doing this job and never realize you've been treating two completely different things as the same thing. He stopped. Then he said, I'm not defending him. I want that on record. What happened on that highway was wrong. But I'm telling you that it wasn't an anomaly. It was the result of a training gap that has been there for years. Culture that doesn't always make it safe to call it out from the inside. Parker was writing. Emily was still. If you were designing a training program, Parker said, what would it include? Reed looked surprised by the question, surprised in the way of someone who hadn't expected to be asked what they thought, or who had been braced for judgment and found something that felt more like consultation. Back. He thought about it. Scenario-based work, he said slowly. Situations where you have to articulate your reason before you act. After, where the process of putting the justification into words forces you to evaluate whether it's actually there. That's useful, Parker said. Not complicated, Reed said. It's just not what we do. We train for escalation, for de-escalation, for evidence collection, 100 other things. We don't specifically train for recognizing when our own assumptions are driving the car. Emily spoke for the first time in several minutes. Her voice was still level, but was something underneath it that hadn't been there before, not anger. There's not forgiveness, something that was working its way toward the complicated middle ground between those two things. What you just described, she said, is exactly what I'm trying to build. Reed looked at her. A community program, she said. The meetings. What Sarah and I are putting together. Their side of what you're describing, teaching riders what to do when someone's assumption gets them pulled over. It's the same gap, their direction. He was quiet for a moment. Theirs, he said. I can see that. Would you be willing to speak at one of our meetings? She asked. Parker looked up from his notes. Reed looked at Emily. Up at your rider rights meeting. I want someone who can explain what the training gap looks like from inside department, she said. Because half the people in those rooms are afraid of officers. What makes them afraid is that they don't understand what the officer is actually thinking. What makes some officers dangerous is that they don't understand what the rider is experiencing. Can stand in both places and explain both sides. That would take a certain kind of courage, Parker said mildly. Reed looked at Emily for a long moment. She looked back at him with the same steadiness she had been holding since the meeting began. Since the stop, since the moment she had pulled out her phone on the side of Highway 17 and decided that the recording was for everyone who couldn't record. Reed said finally, all right, I'll come. Parker formally ended the session. Reed signed the statement. He stood up to leave, and at the door he stopped and turned back. He said. Emily, she said. He nodded once. Emily, the recording you made, the decision to keep it running, that was, he searched for the word, that changed how the whole thing landed. Had that footage, the complaint process would have been you versus documentation. What you gave Parker changed it from a conversation to a record. I know, she said. That was the point. He looked at her, the way people look at someone they have underestimated, and knew they have underestimated and are trying to recalibrate. How old did you say you were? 26, she said. He exhaled through his nose, not a laugh, not quite. Something close to it, something that acknowledged the specific absurdity of being a 15-year veteran and learning something foundational from a 26-year-old mechanic on the side of a highway. Art, he said, and then he was gone. Parker waited until the door closed before he spoke. What are you doing? He asked. Emily looked at the table where Reed's hands had been flat. The recorder had sat between them, where 3 weeks of held breath had finally found somewhere to go. I don't know yet, she said honestly. That was a hard conversation. It was, she said. It was the right one. He nodded. The statement is strong. And with the records data, we have a pattern argument that has real weight. Okay, she said. I'm going to go somewhere, he said. You understand that? When this becomes formal, when we present this to the department and potentially to a civil oversight body, it's going to generate attention. There's media attention, community attention. It's going to be loud for a while. I know. You ready for that? She thought about that question, really thought about it. A reflexive yes that was already forming in her throat. About what loud meant. She thought about what attention meant to a woman who ran a small shop on West Camelback Road and rebuilt motorcycles in the hours most people spent watching television. About what it meant to become the face of something you started because you couldn't in good conscience stop at your own front door. No, she said, probably not, but I'm doing it anyway. Parker smiled brief. Genuine, that's the right answer. She went home that evening and called her father. Raymond picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been waiting for her to call, which was something he had done since she was a child. He never called first when he knew she was in the middle of something, as he had figured out early that she thought better when she didn't feel watched. Always picked up fast. How'd it go, he asked. Reed came in, she said. He gave a full statement. Record. Silence on the line. Then he came in voluntarily. Voluntarily, she confirmed. There's silence. Huh, Raymond said. And in that single syllable was a full sentence about the nature of people and how they sometimes surprise you. That doesn't make everything okay, but it does make things more complicated in a way that is ultimately more honest. She said. He knew. He knew from the beginning the stop didn't have a basis. I figured, Raymond said quietly. And the supervisor, when he should have called it in 30 minutes earlier. Yeah, he said it was loyalty. Kind of loyalty. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Oh, that kind of loyalty, he said. Seen it go bad in a lot of different directions. He agreed to speak at our meeting, she said. Silence this time was longer. An officer. At a writer rights meeting. Yes. Your meeting? Yes. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. She knew what that breathing meant. It was the breathing of a man who was rearranging something in his understanding of the situation, who was finding that the picture was wider than he had expected, was deciding how he felt about that. You sure about that? He asked. Well, no, she said. But I think it's the right move. People are afraid because they don't understand. Understanding goes both ways. He was quiet again. He said, your mother used to say something like that. Emily went still. Raymond almost never mentioned her mother, not because he was hiding anything, not because it was forbidden, but because some losses are so complete that language around them has to be chosen very carefully, and he was a careful man when it came to the things that mattered most. What did she say? Emily asked softly. She used to say, Raymond said slowly, the way to fix something that broken in a system was to find the people on the inside who already knew it was broken and give them somewhere safe to say so. Emily sat with that for a moment. She was smart, Emily said. She was the smartest person I ever knew, Raymond said. The second. Emily laughed, brief, surprised, kind of laugh that is really just emotion, finding the only exit available. I'm serious, he said. And he was. She could love you, she said. I know you do, he said. Now stop calling me and get some sleep. A lot of work to do tomorrow. She did. The second community meeting was 3 times larger than the first. Sarah Mitchell had made her calls, and those calls had found their way to people who made their own calls, and the word had moved through the writing community, the way things move through tight communities fast, specific, and loaded with the particular urgency of information that people recognize as having been needed for a long time before it arrived. 187 people showed up to a space that had been arranged for 80. I stood at the front of that room and looked out at the faces and felt something shift in her chest, not fear, exact, more like the recognition of scale. The sudden understanding that what had started on the shoulder of Highway 17 had become something she couldn't hold in both hands. It become something that was going to hold her for a while instead. She started the way she always started, with her own story, facts, with the timestamp and the documentation and the 41 minutes. She didn't stay there long because the room had stories too. And she had learned from the first meeting that her story was a door, a destination. She opened the door and stepped back. There he came. A man named Gerald, 60 years old, who had been riding since he was 19 and who had been stopped so many times on a particular stretch of I-17 that he had started taking an alternate route just to avoid it. Not because he had done anything wrong. Not because the stopping had become predictable enough that it was easier to add 40 minutes to his commute than to keep having encounters that left him feeling like a suspect for crimes he hadn't committed. I never said anything, Gerald told the room, in a voice that carried the particular steadiness of someone who has finally decided to put something down that they have been carrying a long time. Because I was afraid, exactly. But because who do you say it to? Who listens? And what happens to you if they don't? The room was so quiet Emily could hear the ventilation system. A woman named Priya, 23 years old, had been riding for 2 years and who had consented to search of her saddlebags 6 months ago because an officer told her it would go better for her if she cooperated. And she hadn't known that she could decline. Cooperation was a choice, not a requirement. That the words "it will go better for you" were not a legal statement, but a pressure tactic that she had not been equipped to recognize. She had stood at the side of that road while her belongings were examined, and she had said yes, and she had felt humiliated, and she had gone home and not told anyone because she didn't know if what had happened was legal or not, and not knowing made it harder to talk about. Maybe I was wrong, she said. I thought maybe I just didn't understand the rules, and nobody had ever told me what the rules actually were. Emily handed her one of Parker's handouts. Priya read it. When she looked up, her expression had gone through something, gone from the uncertainty that had been living in her face since she started speaking to something cleaner, something that had a specific quality that Emily recognized because she had felt it herself. The specific quality of a person who has just been given information that recontextualizes something that has been sitting wrong in them for months. I have said no, Priya said. Yes, Emily said. I couldn't. He was wrong, Emily said. Now you know, and now you can tell someone else. Then Marcus Reed walked in. He came in through the side door in his civilian clothes, not his uniform, a deliberate choice that Emily had suggested, and he had agreed to without debate. A uniform in that room would have created a wall before he opened his mouth. Civilian clothes made him a person first. The room felt it when he entered, in a dramatic way, not in the way of a movie where everyone turns and the music changes. It was subtler than that, a shift in the air, a collective adjustment, the way a room adjusts when something unexpected has arrived and people are deciding how to receive it. It was at the back of the room. She caught Emily's eye and raised her eyebrows exactly once. Emily gave the smallest possible nod. She introduced him as a law enforcement officer who had come voluntarily to explain what the training gaps looked like from inside the department, and she kept the introduction short because the longer she talked, the more time people had to build walls, and she needed the walls down for this to work. Reed stood at the front of the room and looked at 187 people who had various amounts of reason to distrust the uniform he wasn't wearing. And he said the first thing he had decided to say, a policy statement and not a prepared speech. He said, I was in the patrol car the day Emily was stopped. I knew from before the lights went on that we didn't have a basis. I turned the lights on anyway. And I want to tell you what that felt like from inside the car. I think it's important for you to understand that the problem isn't always someone who believes they're doing wrong. Sometimes it's someone who has talked himself into believing he's doing right when he isn't. I'm going to talk about how that happens because I think it's the only way to actually fix it. The room let him talk, and something happened that Emily had hoped for, but hadn't let herself count on. They listened, not all of them without reservation, all of them with immediate trust, some of them with crossed arms and careful faces, weighing every word the way you weigh something you've been burned by before. They listened. They asked questions, sharp ones, others fair ones. The kind of questions that only get asked when people are genuinely trying to understand something rather than just win an argument. Gerald, the 60-year-old man who had been riding since 19, raised his hand and said, What do I do the next time I'm stopped on that stretch of road and I already know the officer doesn't have a reason? Reed looked at him. Document it. You ask for the reason on record. Provide your documentation and nothing beyond what's legally required. He paused. You report it. Because the only way the pattern becomes visible from inside the department is if the pattern is documented from outside. And if they don't listen to the report, Gerald pressed. Ours. Then you have a lawyer, Emily said from the side of the room. And you have this room full of people who have the same experience and are willing to put their names on it. The silence after that sentence had a different quality than the silences before it. The silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of something settling, of a room full of people, feeling the specific weight of not being alone in something they had been alone in for a long time. Harold nodded once. That was enough. But then 2/3 of the way through the meeting, while the room was still working through its questions, Reed was explaining the difference between a Terry stop and a pretextual stop and why that difference mattered. A man in the back of the room raised his hand. It was maybe 65, broad-shouldered, someone who had been sitting quietly the entire meeting with the stillness of someone who was listening more carefully than most of the people in the room and deciding something slowly. I have a question, he said, for the young lady. Emily looked toward him. Head. You filed a formal complaint, he said, against the officer. Yes, Emily said. What's happening with that? He asked. I want to know if it matters. I've seen people file complaints. I've seen them go nowhere. I want to know if this one is different. Because if it isn't, then what are we really building here? The room shifted. That was the question. Underneath all the other questions, and that had been sitting in the room since the first person walked through the door. Question about whether any of this was real or whether it was the performance of change without the substance of it. Emily looked at Parker, who was standing near the wall. Parker said, "May I?" Emily nodded. He stepped forward. Formal complaint is currently under departmental review, he said clearly. In addition to that, we have filed a public records request and received documented data on 67 stops in this corridor over the past 18 months where motorcycle riders were stopped and released with no citation, their warning, and no documented cause. We're in the process of presenting that data formally to both the department's Internal Affairs Division and to the city's Civilian Oversight Committee. The room was completely still. 67 stops, the man in the back repeated. In 18 months, Parker confirmed that we could document. There'll be more. And what happens then? The man pressed. With the presentation, that depends on what the Civilian Oversight Committee decides to do, Parker said honestly. What I can tell you is that documented patterns of conduct are treated differently than individual complaints. An individual complaint can be dismissed. A documented pattern, especially one with this level of corroborating evidence, is much harder to set aside. Much harder, the man said. Impossible. Not impossible, Parker acknowledged. Here's what makes this different. He looked at the room. Are the difference. Every person in this room who has a similar experience is willing to document it, who is willing to put their name on a statement that person adds to a record that becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. One complaint is a personal grievance. 100 documented accounts is systemic evidence. The man in the back of the room looked at Emily. Of all this yourself? He asked. Emily almost smiled. Had help, she said. Good help. But yeah, I started thinking about it on the highway while I was waiting to find out if my documentation was going to matter. And does it? He asked. She held his gaze. It mattered enough to get a supervisor called in 41 minutes in, she said. Mattered enough to get a voluntary statement from the officer in the patrol car. Mattered enough to get 67 documented stops into a formal legal filing. So yes, it matters. It matters more than most people think it does until they know it matters. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my name is Arthur. I've been riding for 40 years. I've been stopped, he counted silently, his lips just barely moving. 7 times. Never cited once. Never knew I could document it. You know now, Emily said. Oh. Now, he agreed. He reached out and took one of Parker's handouts from the stack at the end of his row. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "What do I do with this?" And Sarah Mitchell, back of the room, said, "You start by giving it to someone who doesn't have one yet." Arthur looked down at the paper in his hand. Then he turned to the person sitting next to him, a younger woman he had never met before, today, and he held it out. She took it, and that, as much as any legal filing or departmental review or public record request, the moment that something real began. Emily watched it happen and felt something she had not expected to feel in that room. On that evening, something that was not triumph, not yet, not with so much still unresolved and so many fights still ahead, and quieter. Something that felt like purpose finding its own shape, separate from anger, separate from the impulse to respond to what had been done to her, heading now on its own momentum towards something that was genuinely larger than any one person on any one highway. She looked at Reed, still standing at the front of the room with his civilian clothes and his 15 years, the particular expression of a man who has done something difficult and found it was the right thing to do and is still figuring out what to do with that finding. She looked at Arthur, holding the handout out to a stranger. She looked at Priya, who had come to the meeting alone and was now deep in conversation with two other young women who had arrived in the same state of not quite knowing about what her father had said. The only way to fix something that broken in a system is to find the people on the inside who already knew it was broken and give them somewhere safe to say so. She looked at Marcus Reed. She thought, there, looked at the room. She thought, and there they are. And she understood, with the clarity of someone who has been building things long enough to recognize when the foundation is solid, let's start on the shoulder of a highway outside Phoenix with a red Ducati and 41 minutes and a phone held up to record. Everything had become something that was not going to stop because she wanted it to stop. It was going to keep going, not because she was extraordinary. Because the room was full of ordinary people who had finally been given the right tools. And that she knew from years of working on machines, the hardest problems actually got solved, not by one person with all the answers, but by enough people with the right tools. The Civilian Oversight Committee met on the third Tuesday of the month, every month, in a conference room on the fourth floor of a municipal building in downtown Phoenix that most of the city's residents had never set foot in and wouldn't know how to find without directions. The meetings were open to the public. They were rarely attended by more than a dozen people. They're the kind of civic process that functioned in the background of ordinary life. Important, procedurally necessary, and almost entirely invisible to the people whose lives it was designed to protect. Third Tuesday of that particular month, 112 people showed up. They came in riding gear and work clothes and business casual and everything in between. Every chair's in the room and lined the walls and spilled out into the hallway where a second crowd had gathered around a monitor that someone had arranged to carry the live audio feed. They were quiet and organized, and they had arrived 30 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin. Told the committee members everything they needed to know about how seriously the people in that room were taking this. Emily sat in the front row between David Parker and Sarah Mitchell. Her folder in her lap documentation, timeline, records data, Reed's voluntary statement, complaint filing, and the formal petition signed by 241 riders who had submitted their own accounts of stops where no citation had been issued and no legal basis had been stated. 141 names. Parker had told her before that he had never seen that many voluntary signatories on a pattern complaint in 23 years of practice. He had said it the way he said most things, carefully, excess, letting the weight of the words carry without help. But she had heard what was underneath it. She had heard what 23 years sounded like when it was genuinely surprised. At each chair was a woman named Dr. Helena Vasquez, 61 years old, a former public defender who had spent 12 years on the Oversight Committee and who had the specific quality of presence that comes from spending decades in rooms where the stakes are high and the temptation to look away is constant, and you have trained yourself not to look away. the session at exactly the stated time, judged the size of the attendance without making it a performance, and asked Parker to present. Parker stood and presented for 40 minutes. He presented the timeline of the stop. He presented the documentation license, registration, insurance, all valid, all checked, all confirmed clean before the stop was initiated. He presented the 41-minute duration. He presented Sergeant Bennett's on-scene confirmation that the stop had no documented legal basis. He presented Reed's voluntary statement. He presented the public records data, 67 stops, 18 months, no citations, no state cause. And he presented it in the particular way of a man who has been doing this for a long time and knows that the facts laid out cleanly and in sequence are more persuasive than any amount of argument. He did not argue. He documented. He let the numbers speak in the voice that numbers have when they have been assembled correctly, quiet, nice, and very, very difficult to dismiss. When he finished, Dr. Vasquez looked at the folder in front of her for a long moment. She looked up and said, "Miss Carter, would you like to speak?" Emily stood there. She had prepared something, 3 pages, clean, organized the way she organized everything in order, without waste. But standing at the front of that room, looking at the committee members and the 112 people behind her, and the faces of strangers who had come because something she had done had opened a door they hadn't known how to find before, she set the 3 pages at a table and said something different. She said, "I want to tell you about a man named Arthur." The room was very still. "Arthur is 65 years old," she said. "He has been riding motorcycles for 40 years. He has been stopped 11 times on roads in this city. Has never been cited. Not once. Never given a reason. He came to one of our community meetings, and when I told him he had the right to document those stops and report them, he looked at me like I had just told him. The sky was a different color than he had always believed it was." She stopped for a moment. "No," she said. 40 years of riding, 11 stops. And he didn't know he had the right to ask why. Nobody had ever told him. Nobody had ever given him the language or the process or the assurance that if he spoke up, something might actually happen. She looked at the committee, what this is about. Not just my stop, not just 67 stops, about the gap between what people are entitled to on the side of a road and what they actually know when they're standing there. I want this committee to understand that closing that gap is not just a legal question. It's a question about whether people can trust that the process works before they need it. Because right now, a lot of people in this city cannot answer yes to that question. Dr. says, "Miss Carter, what specifically are you asking this committee to do?" Emily picked up her 3 pages and read from them now, because this part needed to be precise. She asked for a formal review of the department's protocols for traffic stop documentation, specifically that legal basis be stated and recorded before a stop is initiated rather than after. She asked for mandatory scenario-based training on the distinction between evidence-based observation and assumption-based profiling. She asked for a community liaison program structured, regular, not performative, between the department and the riding community. And she asked for an independent audit of traffic stop data across all corridors, not just the ones she had been able to access through her records request. She sat down. Parker had told her to keep it specific, keep it actionable. Don't ask for the impossible and don't accept the symbolic. She had listened to him. She had learned in the months since the stop, there was a particular skill to asking for things in official rooms, a skill that was different from being right, different from being passionate, different from having the facts on your side. It was the skill of knowing what the room could actually do and asking for exactly that, and without flinching. Dr. Vasquez looked down the table at the other committee members. All of them were making notes. One of them, a man named Councilman Torres, had been quiet through Parker's entire presentation, leaned forward. He said, "The 67 stops. Are these from a single unit or multiple units?" Parker said, "Patrol units. At least 6 different patrol officers are represented in the data." Torres looked at that information. "This isn't one officer?" "No," Parker said. "It is not. And the stops span how many 14 months of the 18-month period we analyzed, Parker said. Consistently distributed. This is not a cluster event. Ongoing. Torres sat back. How many of those 67 riders filed complaints? Parker said, 4 before Ms. Carter's complaint, which is now on record. 4 out of 67, Torres repeated. Plus, Parker said, and the 63 who didn't file. Some didn't know they could, Parker said, and didn't believe it would matter. Some didn't want to be in a room like this one. Torres was quiet for a moment. They're in this room now, he said, and he wasn't asking Parker, he was looking at the 112 people behind Emily. Something in his face was doing the slow, visible work of a person who has been a public official for long enough to know when a situation has passed the point where procedural courtesy is the right response. Of them, Parker said. Yes. Torres looked at Dr. Vasquez. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not words. She turned to Emily. Miss Carter, I want to ask you a question that is not on the official record. You can choose not to answer. Emily said, were you afraid? Dr. Vasquez asked. On the highway. Were you afraid of what might happen? The room shifted. The kind of question that got asked in these rooms was not the procedural language of oversight committees. It was a woman asking another woman across a table, and real. Emily looked at her steadily. Yes, she said, of Officer Brooks specifically, but afraid of the version of that situation that goes differently. The version where I don't have my documentation perfectly organized. The version where I don't know my rights. The version where I get scared and I say yes to something I didn't have to say yes to. I was afraid of that. Dr. Vasquez nodded slowly. And that fear is what 63 people who didn't file a complaint were feeling, Emily said. Exactly what it was. The room was so quiet that when someone's phone vibrated in the hallway, several people turned toward the sound. Dr. Vasquez picked up her pen. This committee will open a formal review, she said. Mr. Parker will need the full records data submitted to our office by end of week. We'll also be issuing a formal request to the department for a response to the pattern documentation within 30 days. She looked at Emily. Sir, your community meetings, are they continuing? Yes, Emily said. We have 3 more scheduled this month. I'd like someone from this committee to attend, Vasquez said. To oversee, to listen. Would that be acceptable? That would be more than acceptable, Emily said. Walked out of that building. 90 minutes after she walked in, and she stood on the sidewalk in the afternoon heat of Phoenix, and she felt not victorious. There was his, not yet, not with 30 days of department response time ahead and an audit that hadn't started and a pattern that was going to take longer to change than anyone in that room wanted to admit. She felt something more precise than victory. She felt movement. She felt the specific sensation of something that has been stationary beginning, or slowly with friction and effort, and the combined weight of 241 names, move. Parker came out behind her and stood beside her on the sidewalk. That went as well as it could have gone, he said. Sarah said, coming out the other side. Vasquez has teeth, Parker said. Opens a formal review. It doesn't sit in a drawer. Watch her work. She'll push. How long? Emily asked. If they move quickly, 6 months. If the department pushes back, he tilted his hand in the air. Universal gesture for it depends. But the 30-day response is on record. Answer within 30 days, or Vasquez goes public with the non-response. I know that. Emily's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Number she didn't recognize, Phoenix area code. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer. Is this Emily Carter? A woman's voice. Steady, professional, but with something under it, something that sounded like it had been rehearsing this call. Yes, Emily said. My name is Lieutenant Christine Hale, the voice said. I'm with the department's training division. I've been following the situation a pause for weeks. I watched the recording. I've read the complaint. I've seen the data. Emily went very still. Parker watched her face. I'd like to meet with you, Lieutenant Hale said. Officially? Not yet. Just I'd like to have a conversation. What kind of conversation? Emily asked carefully. Where I tell you that 3 of your 4 requests at today's meeting are things I've been trying to get approved internally for 2 years, Hale said. And where I tell you that the reason I couldn't get them approved is the same reason 67 stops happened and 63 of them weren't reported. Emily's hand was tight on the phone. Which reason is that, she asked. Because from the inside, Hale said, it's very easy to believe that the pattern doesn't exist if nobody on the outside is organized enough to prove it. The silence on the line was the kind of silence that changes the shape of a conversation. I tried to change the training, Emily said slowly. For 2 years, Hale confirmed. And now? Now I have a civilian oversight committee opening a formal review and 241 signed accounts and a voluntary statement from a 15-year officer, Hale said. The pattern is documented. Now it's not a training division concern. It's a department-wide accountability question that changes what's possible from the inside. Emily looked at Parker. Up one finger, wait. When do you want to meet? She asked. There's this week, Hale said, before the department issues its formal response. As I want you to know what the response is going to say before it says it. I don't know which parts of it are real and which parts are performance. That sentence landed in Emily's chest like something solid. Thursday, Emily said. 10 o'clock. I'll send you the address. She hung up. Parker was watching her with the particular alertness of a man who has learned to read phone calls from the listening side. The training division lieutenant, who has been trying to get scenario-based training approved for 2 years, Emily said. She wants to meet before the formal response goes out. Parker was very still for exactly 2 seconds. She's inside the department, yes. And she's calling you, yes. He put his hand briefly over his mouth, a gesture she had seen him make before, when he was processing something that changed the landscape. Emily, he said carefully, do you understand what it costs someone in her position to make that call? She thought about Marcus Reed walking into the office in his civilian clothes. About her father's words, the only way to fix something that's broken in a system is to find the people on the inside who already knew it was broken and give them somewhere safe to say so. About 2 years of trying to change a training program from the inside and hitting the same wall over and over because the pattern wasn't documented enough to force the issue. I understand, she said quietly. I understand exactly what it costs. She called her father that evening from her shop, the way she had called him every significant evening since this started, because he was the person whose opinion she trusted most when she was trying to understand whether she was seeing something clearly or just seeing what she wanted to see. Lieutenant from the training division called me today, she said. Raymond was quiet for a moment. What did she want? She wants to help from the inside. She's been trying to get the same training changes through for 2 years. She couldn't move the needle. She thinks our documentation changes the leverage. Does Parker think she's trustworthy? He's checking, Emily said. Dad, she knew things. She knew the specific requests I made at the meeting today. She knew the exact language. She said 3 of the 4 were things she'd been pushing for internally. That could mean she's an ally, Raymond said. It could mean the department sent her to find out how much you know before they write the response. Emily stopped. She had not considered that. She sat with it for a moment, turning it over, looking at it from the direction her father had pointed. You think she might be managing me, Emily said. I think, Raymond said carefully, when something starts going well, the institutions that are in trouble start looking for ways to manage the people that causing the trouble. Always. Not every time, but often enough that you should walk into Thursday's meeting knowing it's possible. How do I tell the difference? She asked. Ask her something you already know the answer to, he said. See how she answers it. If she tells you the truth about the thing you know, you have a better chance she's telling you the truth about the things you don't. She thought about that. Very good at this, she said. I've been in a few rooms, he said dryly. You think motorcycle communities don't have politics? She almost laughed. I'll be careful. I know you will, he said. That's not what I'm worried about. Then what are you worried about? He was quiet for a moment longer than usual. I'm worried that you're carrying a lot, he said finally. I'm worried that the people around you are starting to see you as the engine of this whole thing instead of as a person. Well, engines don't get to be tired. Engines don't get to have bad days. Allowed to be tired, Emily. You're allowed to have a bad day. This doesn't all have to run on what you can put into it every single day. She felt the thing in her throat that she had been keeping below the surface since the highway, since the 41 minutes, since the complaint, there's the data, since the meetings, as today's hearing, she felt it press upward and she held it there, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she was in her shop and she needed to be functional in the morning. Pulse, she said, do you? I know, she said again. Okay. You're more than okay, he said. That's not the same as fine. She didn't answer that. Just get some sleep, he said. Thursday will take care of itself. She slept more than she expected to. Thursday came and Lieutenant Christine Hale walked into the coffee shop on Grand Avenue that Emily had chosen because it was public, and she knew the owner, and she had a clear line to the door because Raymond's warning had stayed with her, and she was going to be careful the way she was always careful, not paranoid, closed, but awake. Hale was 47, with close-cropped hair and the kind of posture that comes from decades of institutional life and the specific additional quality of someone who has spent years inside a system they are ambivalent about. She ordered coffee and sat down and looked at Emily with the directness of someone who had decided in advance not to waste time on preamble. Well, I'm going to tell you something first, Hale said, and I want you to hear it before anything else. I am not here on behalf of the department. I am not here to manage your expectations or your information. I'm here because I have been in this building for 18 years, and I have watched the same problems move in circles, and I am tired of watching them move in circles. Emily held her gaze. Tell me something I already know, she said. Hale blinked. Tell me something about the case that I already know the answer to, Emily said. Being verifiable. Hale looked at her for a long moment. Colorado. Then, and this was the moment Emily had been waiting for, that would tell her almost everything. Hale almost smiled. I told you to do that, she said. Emily says nothing. Voluntary statement from Officer Reed, Hale said. He submitted it on a Wednesday. Parker's office received it at 10:42 in the morning. It was 14 pages. Reed seed the Internal Affairs Division directly, which is unusual. Most volunteers go through the union first. I passed the union. Every single detail was accurate. Emily had the file in her bag. He bypassed the union because he knew the union would advise him not to submit it, Emily said. Thus, Hale said, which tells you something about how much he needed to submit it. Emily relaxed, not all the way, not yet, but enough. She leaned forward. Tell me what the formal response is going to say. Hale wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The formal response is going to acknowledge the complaint, acknowledge the supervisor's on-scene determination, and propose a departmental review of documentation protocols. It's going to be measured and professional, and it's going to look on the surface like the beginning of accountability. But, Emily said, but the review it proposes will be internal, Hale said. External oversight, no timeline requirements, no community involvement, and no mandatory training changes, just a recommendation for review of existing training materials. Emily felt the familiar tightness of something that looks like an answer, but is actually a delay wearing an answer's clothes. The recommendation for review, she said flatly. Yes, Hale said. An implementation, a review. Correct. And if the oversight committee accepts that response, then the 67 stops are logged, a complaint against Brooks is noted, and the department has technically responded. And in 18 months, the data shows 67 more stops. The committee opens another review, and the department responds with another proposal for an internal review of existing materials. Hale's voice was flat, angry past angry, which is a different thing. I have watched that cycle run 4 times in 18 years. Language gets cleaner each time. The outcome stays the same. Emily looked at her. What do we do with this? You take it to Vasquez before the response is formally submitted, Hale said. Or what the response is going to contain, and you ask the committee to require, not request, hire external oversight and a hard timeline on training implementation. If the committee requires it before the department submits, the department has to either comply or explain publicly why it won't. That puts you in a very difficult position, Emily said. If anyone finds out you told me what the response will Say I know what position it puts me in, Hale said. Sure. You could lose your job, Emily said directly. Hale looked at her coffee for a moment. When she looked back up, her expression had something in it that was not bravery. Bravery would have been clean and declarative and too simple. It was something more like the long, complicated resolve of someone who has weighed something for a long time and finally put it on the scale of what matters more. Fadi, I have been in this building for 18 years, she said. I have written training proposals and watched them shelved. I have flagged pattern data and watched it filed. I have had conversations in offices that went nowhere and written reports that collected dust and spent 18 years believing that if I just found the right language, right framing, the right moment, the system would respond from the inside. She stopped. You proved in 41 minutes on a highway that it was going to need help from the outside. Lose my job having done something that worked than keep it having done everything right and change nothing. The silence between them had a different quality than the silences earlier. It was not tension, it was recognition. The specific recognition of two people who have come to the same place from completely different directions and find themselves unexpectedly standing side by side. I'm going to tell Parker, Emily said. Everything you've told me today. I assumed you would, Hale said. Fine. That's the right call. And I'm going to Vasquez, Emily said. Do it before Friday, Hale said. The response goes to the committee Friday afternoon. Emily nodded. Looked at Hale. Why me? She asked. You've been in this building 18 years. The committee, you could have gone to Vasquez yourself. Hale looked at her steadily. I have 18 years of credibility inside that building that I would spend the moment I walked into Vasquez's office before the department's formal response. She stopped, and something shifted in her voice that was quieter than everything before it. The person who stood on the side of a highway for 41 minutes with valid documentation and a clean record and a camera and still had to fight to have the truth matter. Not credentials. That's standing. And in that committee room, right now your standing is worth more than mine. Emily Carter sat in that coffee shop for a long time after Hale left. She sat with her coffee cooling in front of her, and she thought about what standing meant, about it as a mechanic, the way a machine has to be solid at its base before anything built on it can hold weight. About the 41 minutes and the 67 stops and the 241 names and Arthur's 11 stops and Priya's search and Gerald's 40-minute detour and Reed's 14-page statement and her mother's voice on the phone saying, "You're more than okay." Not the same as fine. She thought about all of it at once. Oh, the whole weight of it. The way it had started with one red motorcycle on one stretch of highway and become something that now had a Lieutenant 10 in a coffee shop and an oversight committee that had opened she was going to put in front of Dr. Elena Vasquez before Friday afternoon. She thought about the fact that she was 26 years old, about the fact that none of that had anything to do with whether she was right. She picked up her phone and called Parker. "I need you to clear your morning tomorrow," she said. "Why?" he asked. "Because we're going to Vasquez before the department's response goes out," she said. "And we need to go in with enough to require external oversight and a hard timeline." A brief silence. Parker said, "What happened at the meeting with Hale?" "She gave me the response before it was written," Emily said. Word for word, Emily. His voice was careful, precise, completely serious. "Do you understand what that means?" "She risked to do that." "I understand exactly what it means," she said. "That's why we have to make it count." She hung up and looked at her phone for a moment. Then she typed a single text to her father. "You were right about asking the verifiable question." His response came back in less than a minute. "I usually am. Don't tell anyone." She put the phone in her pocket, back to her shop. She picked up a torque wrench, and she finished the engine she had been building, and she worked until 10 o'clock that night in the particular focused silence of someone who has too much to think about to stop moving. Underneath the work, underneath the careful measured pull of every bolt, something was running that had been running since the highway and had not stopped once since then. The knowledge that she was not finished, that the response was coming Friday. Vasquez needed to know before it arrived. that 241 people had put their names on something and were waiting for it to matter, and that it was going to matter. Not because she was certain about every step between here and the end of this. She had stood on a highway for 41 minutes with valid documentation in her hand and the truth on her side, and she had not moved, and she was not moving now. Parker got to Vasquez's office at 8:47 on Friday morning, 13 minutes before their scheduled appointment and 4 hours before the department's formal response was due to hit the committee's inbox. He had the full documentation package under his arm, Reed's statement, thirds data, the 241 signatures, complaint filing, and a single additional page that he had typed himself the night before after hanging up with Emily, which laid out in the precise and unornamental language of 23 years of practice exactly what the department's response was going to say and exactly why the committee needed to require more before accepting it. Emily was already there. She was sitting in the waiting area outside Vasquez's office with her folder in her lap and her back straight and her hands completely still. Parker had learned enough about her in the past 4 months to know that the stillness was not calm. It was the thing she did instead of pacing, their internal management of a person who has learned to keep everything useful on the surface and everything else below it until the moment was over. Well, he asked, sitting beside her. Some, she said. Oh. She looked at him. I've been ready since the highway. He almost smiled. And I know you have. Vasquez opened her door at exactly 9 o'clock, the way she had opened the committee session at exactly the stated time. A person opens every door when they have decided that punctuality is a form of respect. Sure. She looked at Emily. He caught at the folder and the additional page, and whatever was in her expression was not surprise. She had been on this committee for 12 years, and she had developed the particular quality of a person who does not surprise easily, not because they are cynical, but because they have learned to expect that the situations that come to them are usually more complicated than they first appear. "Man," she said. They sat down. Parker laid the additional page on her desk first. Sure. She read it without speaking. She read it the way she read everything completely, skipping, giving each sentence exactly the weight it carried. When she finished, she set it flat on her desk and looked at Parker. "I have a source for this," she said. It was not a question. Credible one, Parker said. Inside the department, voluntary, at significant personal risk. Vasquez looked at the page again. Recommendation for review of existing training materials, she said. Well, reading from it, internal oversight only. No external involvement. On timeline? Yes, Parker said. She was quiet for a moment. Mr. Parker, I want to ask you something directly. Of course. In your assessments based on 23 years, if this committee accepts that response, what happens? Parker said, the complaint is logged. The department has technically responded. The pattern data is filed. And in 18 months, the next records request looks substantially similar to this one. Vasquez looked at Emily. Sure. Same question. Emily said Arthur files his 12th stop without a citation. Priya says yes to another search she didn't have to consent to. The next person who gets pulled over on Highway 17 doesn't know they have the right to record because the gap was never closed. Vasquez picked up her pen. She wrote for approximately 90 seconds, not notes. Something more deliberate. Then she picked up her phone and said to whoever answered, I need to move to 10 o'clock. Clear my morning. Get me the department's legal liaison, please. Listeners now. She put the phone down and looked at Parker. The formal response is submitted. The committee has the authority to issue a pre-response requirement, a set of conditions that the response must address in order to be accepted for review. Must to be issued before the response arrives. She looked at the clock on her wall. We have 3 hours and 40 minutes. Parker said, what does it need to include? External oversight appointment, Vasquez said. Independent of the department. Hard timeline. I'll propose 90 days for training implementation, review, community liaison structure with a defined meeting frequency and documented outcome reporting, an independent audit of stop data across all corridors, the requested sections. She paused. Does that match what you asked for at the committee session? 3 of the 4 exactly, Emily said. The Earth goes further than I asked for. The 4th should go further, Vasquez said simply. Likes me for what you thought you could get. I'm telling you what the situation actually requires. She looked at Emily steadily. The pattern you documented across 18 months in specific corridors, if it holds across all corridors, there is not 67. Emily went still. Many. I don't know yet, Vasquez said. Neither does anyone else. Because nobody has done the full audit. That's the point. We're going to find out. The room was very quiet for a moment. Vasquez said, I want to tell you something that is also not on the official record. I've been on this committee for 12 years. I have seen complaints filed and shelved and resolved on paper and forgotten in practice. I've seen pattern data disappear into internal reviews that produce no changes. In other words, I have seen the cycle that your attorney just described. I have sat in this chair through 3 iterations of it. She stopped. What is different this time is not the documentation, although the documentation is exceptional. What is different is you, the community behind you, the officer who came in voluntarily, the training lieutenant who risked her position to give you information that forces this committee to act before the department can frame the narrative. She leaned forward slightly and responds to pressure. Not always, not fast enough. It responds. And you have built more organized, documented, more cross-institutional pressure than anything I have seen come through this office in 12 years. Emily sat with that for a long moment. Let them slow walk it, she said finally. Whatever you issue today, whatever requirements go out before that response arrives, make the timeline public. Because if it's not public, the 90 days becomes 120, becomes 200, and then it's internal review language again. Vasquez looked at her. You want the pre-response requirements made public before the department knows they're coming. I want them made public at the same time the department receives them, Emily said. There's no window to negotiate them down before anyone outside this room knows they exist. Parker looked at Emily. Vasquez looked at Emily. There was a very specific quality to the silence in that room. The quality of 2 people who are experienced and accomplished and have been doing this for a long time, themselves looking at a 26-year-old motorcycle mechanic and recognizing something that does not come from years of experience and cannot be taught in a classroom or a law office or a committee chamber. It was from standing on the side of a road for 41 minutes with everything in order and everything at risk and not moving. Yes, Vasquez said. That's what we'll do. She picked up the phone again. A pre-response requirement went out at 11:53 in the morning. 7 minutes before the department's formal response arrived in the committee's inbox. It was 4 pages. It was specific. It was public release simultaneously to the committee's website, office, and to the local press contacts Vasquez used when she needed something to move faster than institutional inertia allowed. Emily was in Parker's car when Parker's phone showed him the confirmation. That it and said simply, "It's out." She exhaled. It was the first full exhale she had taken in what felt like 4 months. "Now we wait," she said. "Now we wait," he agreed. Department had 30 days to respond to the pre-response requirements. 28th day, their response arrived. It was 12 pages. It accepted all 4 requirements. Parker called Emily the moment he read it. His voice, when she picked up, had the specific quality of a man who has been doing this for 23 years and has learned not to celebrate too early but is finding it difficult. They accepted it, he said. All 4. External oversight appointment within 30 days. A 90-day training implementation timeline with monthly reporting to the committee. Community liaison program. First meeting within 60 days. Auditor audit. Independent auditor. Report due in 6 months. Emily sat down on the shop floor. She didn't remember deciding to sit her legs, just made the decision without asking. Accepted it, she said. Every point, Parker said. The training language is specific scenario-based, inventory, department-wide, not a review of existing materials. New curriculum, developed with external input. She put her free hand flat on the floor of her shop. Concrete was cool and solid under her palm. "David," she said. But it was the first time she had used his first name. Oh, he said. Is it real? He said. Documented as it's timeline bound, and it has an external oversight appointment to enforce it. There. It's real. She sat there for a moment on the floor of her shop, surrounded by the tools and parts and machines that had been her life since she was 11 years old, and she let the reality of it settle without rushing it, because it was the kind of moment that deserved to be felt at its actual size rather than moved through quickly. Her father, he picked up on the first ring this time. Hello, she said. Something in her voice told him before the words arrived, because he was her father, and he had been reading her voice since she learned to use it. There, he said quietly. They accepted it, she said. All four, 90 days, external oversight, mandatory training. It. Full audit, silence on the line, not the silence of someone who didn't know what to say. The silence of someone who was feeling something too complete for immediate words. The silence of a father who had put a wrench in his daughter's hand when she was 11 and told her every single day that knowledge was the one thing nobody could take from her on the side of a road. There, she said. I'm here, he said. His voice was not quite steady. Okay, she asked. He laughed brief, a little rough around the edges. I'm the one who should be asking you that. You always are, she said. Okay, another pause. Yeah, he said. Yeah, okay. And then, after a moment, your mom would have loved this. She felt the thing in her throat press upward, and she let it, hers this time, because she was alone in her shop, and the fight was over, and she had earned the right to let it move. Me something she would have said, Emily said. Raymond was quiet for a moment, and she could imagine him the way she always could, sitting in the kitchen of the house she grew up in. The way he sat when he was thinking, with one hand flat on the table and his eyes on the middle distance. Well, she would have said, he started slowly, that you don't fix the road for yourself. You fix it because the next person coming down it deserves better than what you found. He stopped. She would have said it cleaner than that. She always said things cleaner than me. She sounds like she was something, Emily said softly. She was everything, Raymond said. And then, because he was Raymond Carter and he was a man who knew when a moment had been fully felt and needed to be gently closed, the people who helped you get here. Call Sarah. Call Reed if you're inclined. And then close the shop and go ride your motorcycle. Because you built it and you've earned it, and you haven't just ridden for pleasure in 4 months. She laughed. How do you know that? Because I know you, he said. When you're working on something that matters, you stop doing the things that don't have a purpose. You haven't just ridden for the feeling of it since the highway. He was right. Always right about the things like that. I'll ride this afternoon, she said. Good, he said. I'll see you Sunday, she called Sarah next. Sarah answered, and Emily told her in 3 sentences, and Sarah said nothing for a long moment, and then said, the community tonight. And Emily said yes. And Sarah said, give me 2 hours. And she heard Sarah already beginning to dial someone else before the call was finished. About calling Reed. She sat with the question of it, the particular question of what you owe someone who did the right thing later than they should have and has been living with that since. About the coffee shop meeting with Hale, 18 years, and the training proposals that went nowhere. And the moment she had decided that her standing inside the building was worth less than what Emily's standing outside it could do. I'll read first. He picked up on the 3rd ring. Carter, he said. Not Miss Carter anymore. Carter. She had become a last name to him, the particular shorthand of someone you have been through something with. Her went through, she said. All 4 requirements. Day implementation, external oversight, mandatory scenario-based training, audit. The silence on his end was longer than she expected. Reed, she said. Yeah, he said. I'm here. He stopped. Scenario-based training. That's the one that he stopped again. And you described in your statement, she said. Hers. Yeah, he said quietly. Exactly what I described. They're implementing it department-wide, she said. Their curriculum. External input required in the development. Another silence. How long did you say? 90 days, she said, with monthly reporting to the committee. Public reporting. She heard him exhale. It was a sound she recognized, the sound of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. Here's Reed, she said. The statement you gave, the fact that you came in voluntarily, gave the committee something it couldn't get from the records data alone. It gave them the inside confirmation that the gap was real. It wasn't an isolated incident, that it was structural. She paused. That mattered. I want you to know it mattered. He was quiet for a moment. And the supervisor, 41 minutes late, he said. Oh, she said, I should have called it in before the lights went on. I know that too, she said. Sure. And then, but you came in. You didn't have to. And what you said in that room changed what Parker could put in front of the committee. I'm telling you, it mattered. You can decide what to do with that. He was quiet for so long she thought the line had dropped. How's the bike? He asked finally. She blinked. Then she understood he was asking because he didn't know how to receive what she had just said. And this was the way out of the moment that saved both of them from having to handle it fully right now. Perfectly, she said. Yeah, he said. I figured it would be. She called Hale last. Hale was the shortest. It went through, Emily said. Hale said, I know. I saw the public release. A pause. Are you? Tired, Emily said, really tired. That's allowed, Hale said. They said the same thing. Your father sounds like someone worth listening to, Hale said. Emily said. Hale, are you okay? Inside the building. Okay. The pause was longer this time. There will be conversations, Hale said carefully. People know I met with you. Nobody can prove what was said. People know. There will be a period of difficulty. I'm sorry, Emily said. B, Hale said immediately. I told you in the coffee shop what it was worth to me. I meant it. I have been in that building 18 years watching the cycle run, watching training proposals collect dust, watching pattern data get filed and forgotten. She stopped. This week, I watched an independent auditor get appointed, a 90-day training timeline get set in public writing, and a full corridor audit get ordered for the first time in the department's history. All of that happened in 30 days because a 26-year-old mechanic documented 41 minutes on a highway and refused to let it be just her problem. Another pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, firmer, the voice of a woman who has made a decision and is standing behind it. I'm fine, Emily. I'm better than fine. The community meeting that Sarah called for that evening was not organized the way the previous meetings had been. There was no agenda, no handouts, no whiteboard. Sarah sent the message through the network she had built, and the network carried it the way only tight communities carry things fast and complete, or the person through the channels that exist because people built them over decades of showing up for each other. Right. Emily has news. 160 people came. Stood at the front of the room, and she did not have 3 pages of prepared remarks this time. She had 4 months of everything it had taken to get from a highway shoulder to this room. And she understood that the people in front of her had been part of it, had signed their names and told their stories and come to meetings and passed handouts to strangers in folding chairs. And she owed them the truth told simply. Hunt through, she said. All of it. External oversight. 90-day mandatory training. Community liaison program. Audit. The room erupted. Not politely, not professionally, not in the measured way of a committee chamber or a legal office. In the full, uncomplicated human way of people who have been hoping for something and have just found out it was real voices and movement and the specific sound of collective relief that has a frequency all its own. Emily stood at the front of it and let it happen around her. And she felt something she had not let herself feel since the highway. She felt it fully, managing it, without keeping it below the surface. The weight lift, not all of it. Never all of it. As the audit was still ahead and the training implementation had 90 days to prove itself, and the community liaison program had to be built into something real and not performative. And there were still people on roads in this city who didn't have the handout, didn't know they could record, who still said yes when they meant no because nobody had told them they were allowed to mean no. The weight of the beginning, the weight of the 41 minutes, and the uncertainty of whether the facts were going to matter, that weight had moved. It had been picked up by the structure of a formal requirement and an external oversight appointment and a public timeline, and it no longer rested entirely in her hands. That was what it felt like. Victory, transfer. The weight moved from one person's hands into a structure that was bigger than one person. That was how change actually worked. She understood now. Certain. Not one person carrying it forever, one person carrying it far enough to hand it to something larger. The other was in the room. He was standing near the wall the way he had stood at the first meeting, the 65-year-old man who had been riding for 40 years and had never filed a complaint and hadn't known he could. His face in the crowd, and he found hers at the same moment, the way people find each other in rooms when they have a specific connection that the rest of the room doesn't fully know about. At her. One nod. She nodded back. That was enough. Freya was there too, standing with the two women she had met at the second meeting. The three of them, having become something friends, realized a small specific community formed from shared experience of being told no when the law said yes. Emily's eye and mouth something that Emily couldn't quite read across the room. Correcto. Later, when the crowd had thinned enough to move through it, Leah found her. I filed my complaint, she said, 3 weeks ago, about the search. Parker helped me with the language. Emily looked at her. You didn't tell me. I wanted to see if it went anywhere before I said anything, Priya said. I didn't want to count on it and then have it go nowhere. And Priya's expression moved through something. In the audit file, she said, Parker said it would be part of the independent review, which means someone who doesn't work for the department is going to look at it and determine whether the officer acted within his authority. Yes, Emily said. Someone independent, Priya said, as if testing the word, as if the word was new in a way now that mattered. Someone independent, Emily confirmed. Priya looked at her for a long moment. She was 23 years old, and she had stood on the side of a road 6 months ago and said yes when she meant no, and had carried it alone until she came to a meeting in a room with folding chairs and found out she hadn't needed to carry it alone. Like you, she said. Emily shook her head. You filed the complaint, she said. You put your name on it because you showed me it was possible, Priya said. But Emily looked at her, really looked at her, the way she had tried to look at everyone since the highway, without the filter, without the assembled picture, that's the person, and she said, now you show someone else. 3 months after the formal acceptance of the requirements, the independent auditor released his preliminary report. There was not 67. Across all corridors, that's the full data set, over 30 months, rather than the 18-month window Emily had originally requested, of documented stops involving motorcycle riders with no citation, no warning, no stated cause, and no arrest was 411. 111. Parker called Emily with the number the morning the preliminary report went public, and he said it. The way you say numbers that are too large to say easily, slowly, with space around each part of it. She sat with it, the way she sat with everything important, without rushing past it, letting herself move before the full weight of it had arrived. 111 people, she said. In 30 months, Parker said. The full set of corridors. And before 30 months, the auditor can't go further back with the existing documentation, Parker said. Keeping before that point is inconsistent enough that the data isn't reliable. He notes that there is no evidence the pattern began 30 months ago. It goes further back, she said. Almost certainly, Parker said. She thought about Arthur and his 40 years, about 40 years of 411, becoming something much larger. Numerous numbers she didn't have language for the accumulated sum of all the people on all the roads who had said some waited too long, and not known they could ask, and not known they could record, and not known they could file, and not known anyone would listen. Going to the committee? She said. This morning, Parker said. Vasquez is convening a special session next week. I'll be there, Emily said. Oh, he said. She went to the special session. She sat in the same front row where she sat for the first committee hearing, and she listened to the auditor present 411 stops with the same clean, precise language that Parker had used when he presented 67. And she watched the committee members hear the number and watch their faces do what faces do when a number is larger than when a number crosses from concerning to undeniable. Committee voted that day on 3 additional measures that went beyond the original 4 requirements: a review board with permanent community representation, public annual reporting requirement on stop data across all corridors, a formal grievance process for riders who had experienced stops they believed were unlawful with a 2-year look-back period to allow people to document incidents that had occurred before the formal process existed. The 2-year look-back was the one Emily had not asked for. Past, she looked at Vasquez. Vasquez looked back at her. The look-back was your idea, Emily said after the session. Editor's preliminary report made it obvious, Vasquez said. It goes back further than 30 months, and we believe it does. Then the people who were stopped before the documentation existed still deserve a process. Arthur, Emily said quietly. Guys looked at her. He can file, she said, for every documented incident he remembers. Go back 40 years, but we can go back 2 years is a start. Emily called Arthur that afternoon. Told him about the look-back provision. She explained what it meant that he could document the stops from the past 2 years through the new formal grievance process. It would be reviewed by an independent board with community representation, that he did not have to navigate it alone, because Parker's office was providing assistance to anyone who needed help with the filing. Silence on Arthur's end of the line was different from any silence she had heard from him before. 2 years, he said finally. 2 years, she confirmed. I have 5 stops in the last 2 years, he said. I remember them. The dates, the locations, the officer numbers. I wrote them down because he stopped. I started writing them down because my grandson told me I should. Oh, he said, Grandpa, if it keeps happening, you should write it down. I didn't know what for. I just started writing them down. Emily felt something in her chest that had no name she knew. Arthur, she said, your grandson was right. He's a smart kid, Arthur said. And then his voice did something, shifted, broke slightly at the edge. Came back. I've been riding for 40 years, and I always just thought this was the road. This was just what the road was. I know, Emily said softly. It doesn't have to be, he said. Not asking. Saying, she said, it doesn't. He filed the grievance the following week. All 5 stops documented, organized with dates and locations and officer identification numbers, held in the new formal process with Parker's office assisting on the language. He was the 47th person to file through the new process. But by the end of the first month, there were 119 filings. The training curriculum launched on the 87th day of the 90-day timeline, 3 days early, Parker said, was either genuine commitment or optics. The truth was probably somewhere in between. And either way, the curriculum launched. Emily did not attend the launch. She was invited to. Vasquez extended the invitation personally, and she appreciated it, and she declined as she understood that there was a difference between the things she needed to be present for and the things that needed to happen without her presence in order to prove they were real and not dependent on her being in the room. The curriculum needed to run without her in the room. That was the point. She heard about it from Reed, who texted her 3 words on the morning of the first training session. And real, she texted back 2 words. I know. 6 months after the highway, on a Saturday morning that had not decided yet whether it was going to be hot or just warm, Jimmy Carter took the red Ducati Panigale V4 out of the shop and onto the street and then onto the highway, the same stretch, marker where everything had started, and she rode. Document anything, not to prove anything, not to be anywhere specific or to accomplish anything measurable. She rode because her father had told her to ride for the feeling of it, and she had been neglecting the feeling of it for 4 months, and it was time to stop neglecting it. A road, and the engine ran exactly right, tuned and balanced and precise, the way she had built it to run, and the road moved under her, the way it always had, unconcerned and constant, same in both directions, carrying everything and everyone without judgment. That's mile marker 41. She didn't slow down. She didn't need to. Raymond was waiting at a rest stop 3 miles further on. As she had told him she was riding, and he had said nothing, and then shown up with his own bike and 2 coffees in the particular way he had of appearing without being asked when she needed someone to appear. And then beside him, and they sat in the morning with their coffees and said almost nothing. For a long time, the way people who love each other sit together when the thing they've been working toward has arrived, and they need a moment to simply be in the same place with it. How does the road feel? He asked finally. She thought about it. That's, she said. He nodded. He sipped his coffee. At the highway moving past them in both directions. Always was, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said. Now more people know theirs is too. He was quiet for a moment. Claire. Then he said, your mother would have had something better to say. She always does, Emily said. Through you, he looked at her sideways. Then he did something he rarely did. He laughed. The laugh of a man who has been holding something a long time and has found the right moment to set it down. He lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and then it settled into the comfortable silence they were good at. They finished their coffees. They got back on their bikes, and they rode together down the same highway where everything began. Riders moving at a steady, legal pace in the clear morning air, carrying nothing they hadn't chosen to because the fight for what was right had been fought. Documentation had been filed, and the training was running. It was complete, and 411 stops were on record, where 67 had been buried. 119 grievances had been filed by people who now knew they had the right to file them. There's 5 stops from the past 2 years were formally documented, and under independent review, Leah knew she could say no, and Gerald had stopped taking the 40-minute detour because the road was his road, and he had always known it, and now the record knew it too. And a 26-year-old mechanic had stood on a highway for 41 minutes with everything in order and everything at risk. And she had not moved, and she had not been silent, and she had not accepted that facts were supposed to lose to assumptions just because assumptions were louder. She had recorded it. She had filed it. Every person who had been through a version of it and given them the language and the process and the evidence that their experience was not imaginary and not acceptable and not something they had to carry alone. She had built it the same way she built everything part by part, the right tools, without skipping any step, until what was broken became something that worked. That was who Emily Carter was. That was who she had always been. On that highway, on that Saturday morning, riding beside her father in the directions the road opened it toward, she was exactly that person, no more, no less. And the road ahead was clear, the engine was true, and she knew with the certainty of someone who has done the hardest thing and found it was possible, the next person on this road would not stand alone. She had made sure of it, and that was enough. That was everything.